Hey everyone. A man once told a story about visiting an orange grove with a broken irrigation system. He was there to repair it, and the weather had been unseasonably hot and dry. Many orange trees in the grove were beginning to die for a lack of water, and so these trees needed working irrigation or they were in trouble. A man who was in the orchard at the time but did not live there or work there, took the visitor to see his own grove of orange trees, which were looking really good, green, still flourishing, still lush. And the owner said, these orange trees could go another 2 weeks without water on them, because when they were young trees, I frequently withheld water. As a result of that hardship, their roots go very deep. Now they are the most deeply rooted trees in the area. While others are being scorched by the sun, these are finding moisture at great depth. We're in chapter 8, beginning in verse 18 today. Paul began back in chapter 5 with the subject of the assurance that we have of our salvation, and that has been the subject of chapters 5, 6, 7, and 8. Back in the first 11 verses of chapter 5, Paul had very briefly brought up the subject of our suffering. And I'm just going to read a couple of verses from chapter 5. I'm going to read the first 5 verses. Therefore, since we have been justified through faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Jesus Christ, through whom we have gained access by faith into this grace in which we now stand. And we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And hope does not put us to shame, because God's love has been poured out into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. So now he's going to pick up the subject of suffering again. And for sure, suffering can make us question our salvation. It can make us wonder if we're safe in our relationship with Christ. It can make us doubt God's love. So how does suffering fit into the subject of our confidence in our standing with God? I'm going to read the last verse from the section we covered last week and the first verse of this one. So starting in chapter 8, verse 17, just going to read 2 verses. Now, if we are children, then we are heirs, heirs of God and co-heirs with Christ, if indeed we share in his sufferings, in order that we may also share in his glory. I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed to us. Paul has said that we need to share in the sufferings of Christ in order to share his glory. And in verse 18, he tells us there is this weight to this glory. Suffering is heavy, isn't it? Sometimes it's so heavy that we feel as if we can't stand up under it, as if we can barely breathe. We suffer under the trauma and the horror that comes from living in a broken world. Illness, death, loss, grief, pain, betrayal and lies, war and famine, and we suffer under the persecution of our faith. Here in North America, that isn't something we face, but in many countries, it's very real and very heavy. They suffer the loss of family, abandonment, hatred, and persecution, imprisonment, and even death. But Paul is saying that suffering has good results. It brings a weight of glory, a greater weight than that of the suffering. In fact, he says that the weight of the glory is so great, it makes the suffering look light. That's hard to imagine when you consider the weight of some of the things you might have to carry. Paul is not trying to hide the fact that believers suffer. In fact, he puts it out there that we will do so that we can clearly see it and expect it. But it's not without purpose, and it's not without hope. As the withholding of water from young orange trees caused them to put down deep roots, so too suffering brings about a positive result, which Paul calls glory. And the glory is still to come. It's still future. We can't see it yet, but it will be revealed to us one day. The word in, where it says it will be revealed in us, is not an easy phrase to translate or understand. Dr. Moo says it implies that the glory already exists, but will someday come to reside inside of us. It already resides in heaven, but someday will be transformed. We will be transformed to be what we are meant to be, and then it will be transferred to us to reside in us fully and to be on display. Now, Paul's going to pick up further on the subject of suffering as a component of our salvation. And he begins by using the example of creation in verses 19 to 22. In this section, Paul uses a device called personification. He is giving human characteristics to creation and endowing it with human emotions. And this is for effect. He speaks about creation having frustration and travailing and groaning. Now, of course, creation doesn't feel frustration or groan. This is given to give us a picture of the point he's trying to make. I should say that some people wonder what Paul means by creation. I mean, after all, if he means human beings, then yes, we do feel frustration and we do have consciousness and we do therefore suffer and groan and so on. But he says in verse 20 that the creation is subjected to this frustration not by its own choice. Well, that seems to rule out that he's speaking simply of human beings. We are under the weight of suffering by our own choice. Not that every suffering that falls on us is something we've chosen, but sin in the world is the result of the choice of humanity. It is the result of the choice of Adam and Eve. And so this most likely the conclusion of this is that the creation is meant here as a whole. The rocks, the mountains, the trees, the animals, the stars, everything. That creation itself, the whole of it, is under the frustration of suffering for sin and not by its own choice or its own fault. It is subjected to this state of frustration and travail by the one who subjected it. Now, who is that? Again, a few options have to be considered. Is it Adam, who put creation under the weight of sin in the first place? Is it Satan, who holds creation under sin for his own purposes? Or is it God, who subjects creation to this frustration and groaning as a part of his just judgment for sin? Well, a clue lies at the end of verse 20, where it says, it is subjected in hope. Now, Adam had no hope to offer. He cannot repair creation or restore what was lost, and neither can we, his descendants. Satan has no intention of offering hope. He wants damage. He hates us. He doesn't intend to offer any hope of any kind. So this then is God who subjects creation to this frustration and struggle, but in hope. He offers the hope, the certain outcome that he will restore and renew, that creation will be set free of the decay and the damage done by sin. The idea of the coming restoration of the creation is throughout the Old Testament. For example, you could look at Isaiah 65, 17 to 21. So Paul is using a commonly understood concept, at least in terms of his Jewish audience. This is an example and encouragement for us who are bound up with this creation. As the creation itself has hope, so do we. Suffering is hard, and a frustration or a travail causes groaning, but it has an end, and hope waits for us on the other side. A certain promise of restoration and renewal. It is the hope of that coming glory. The image of travail is used in verse 22, and that's a picture of childbirth, which a lot of us are familiar with firsthand. Labor, hard work, pain, and suffering, but with a joyous outcome, a child. It is a momentary thing that results in eternal joy. The picture is meant to portray that suffering, even though it seems long to us, is of short duration and has an end. It is only here and now. And eternity, however, will provide a counterweight that is huge, the confident expectation of glory that makes the suffering seem light. So suffering does not undermine our assurance, for we have hope for the outcome of the suffering. Then in verse 23, he talks about how we too groan under the weight of suffering and the time of trouble in which we live. So I'm going to read verses 23 to 25. Not only so, But we ourselves who have the first fruits of the Spirit groan inwardly as we wait eagerly for our adoption to sonship, the redemption of our bodies. For in this hope we were saved. But hope that is seen is no hope at all. Who hopes for what they already have? But if we hope for what we do not yet have, we wait for it patiently. One question that jumps out in this part is about the Spirit. Is it saying that we groan in spirit of the fact that we have the Spirit? Dr. Moose says no. It says we are groaning in frustration at the damage and struggle because we have the Spirit. It is through the Spirit that God creates for us a desire for righteousness and a frustration and a hatred of all that is broken and wrong in this world. I mean, people who don't know God, yes, they are frustrated and they groan under pain and death and all of those kinds of things. They don't like them and don't want them, but they do not long for a restoration. They do not have any hope that anything will ever change. They don't think there's any repair for this broken world. But the Spirit in us causes us to want the creation to be made right, so it meets the righteous standard God has for what he has made. Did you wonder about the phrase, we wait eagerly for our adoption of sons, as sons? After all, isn't our adoption already a done deal? Are we not already his children? Well, that's one of those already but not yet tensions in the story of salvation. We are his children. We have been adopted, but it's not yet fully realized or fully experienced. We are not yet fully what he wants us to be, nor has he yet fully given us all the benefits that come with our adoption. We have not yet received our full inheritance. We have not yet been raised from the dead, which is referred to in verse 23 when it speaks of the redemption of our bodies. We have not yet left behind old age, gray hair, or our sin nature and moved into the resurrected life that God has for us. These verses tell us we are waiting for this hope. It says that if we had it already, it would not be hope. It is a certain thing, but it's something we don't yet fully possess. Verse 25 says, if we hope for what we do not have, we wait patiently for it. And this is one of the results of suffering. We suffer, but then we cling to that hope. And that hope gives us the ability to endure patiently until it comes. The idea is of craning your neck to look for someone who's coming and hasn't yet arrived, to keep straining to see the one that we're waiting for. We cling to the hope that's grounded in God himself and crane our necks to see his restoration come. And we endure because of the certainty of that hope. Now, in verses 26 to 27, Paul shows us that suffering does not derail the assurance of our salvation because the Spirit sustains us. So we're going to read those verses, chapter 8, 26 and 27. In the same way, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. We do not know what we ought to pray for, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us through wordless groans. And he who searches our hearts knows the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for God's people in accordance with the will of God. What is this weakness of ours in which we need help? Well, it's our human limitations. We do not know the plans of God fully. We cannot see the future. We can't help ourselves in the middle of our trouble or suffering. We cannot provide strength in ourselves to persevere, and we cannot bring about the change we want to see. Therefore, we don't even really know how to pray. We often don't know what to ask for. We don't know what's best. Sometimes we don't even recognize the mess we're in, and so the Spirit intercedes for us. He does it with groaning that words cannot express. What does that mean? Well, it's hard to know exactly, but it means that the Spirit intercedes for us either in unexpressed ways or in expressed ways that are not words. These groanings perfectly, however, express the will of God for us. We don't know what to pray, but the Spirit of God, who is himself fully God, knows exactly what we need and exactly what the will of God is for us and for our world. So he intercedes for us in accordance with that will of God. Jesus is said to intercede for us before his Father. This is in chapter 8, verse 34. He does so guaranteeing our salvation. But here the Spirit does so regarding our endurance and hope. He sustains our life while we try and live here under the struggle of a broken world and of sin. And God the Father hears. He answers the prayers of the Spirit. Our inability to know how to pray or for what in no way hinders the working out of God's perfect plan. When we do not know how to pray, the Spirit does it for us, and then the Father answers. And so we have help to endure the suffering of this life and to wait in hope. Suffering does not undermine our assurance of our salvation. Suffering shows us the desperate need this world has for the renewing, restoring work of God that is coming. Suffering teaches us to hold on to the certainty of what God has promised and to wait with patience and endurance for the day of glory. Suffering drives our roots deep into the soil of God's promises, and the Spirit prays for us and intercedes for us so that we can endure. And one day, the weight of suffering will seem like the weight of a feather in comparison to the intense glory God has for us. Suffering keeps our eyes on the certain hope of God. Suffering keeps our eyes on the certain hope of God. I remember hearing a story once about a guy. He was talking about how he'd taken his son on a hike one day, and the kid was just a toddler, less than a year and a half old, and he was in a backpack on his dad's back. The day was bright and sunny, and they went on quite a lengthy hike. It wasn't overly steep, but it was fairly long in the woods, and they got out quite a ways from the parking lot where they had begun, well over an hour into the walk, when suddenly the sky clouded over and the rain began to fall. A thunderstorm rolled in, and the thunder began to roll, and lightning flashed across the sky. And the child was not only getting wet, but was terrified of the thunder. The man took his son from his back and tucked him inside his coat, zipping it up over the child. He hunched forward, trying to keep the rain off his son, and then he turned and hurried as fast as he could back toward the car. And as he did so, he spoke to the boy, reassuring him, telling him how much he loved him. He said that the time in the storm did more to bond his son to him than the walk in the sunshine had ever done. That's how suffering works for us. It tunes us to the voice of our Father, who lovingly tells us that it will be okay in the end and that he is here. And that helps drive our roots deep into his promises. In what way are you feeling the weight of the struggles of life today? Is there some suffering in your life? If not, hold on, for it will come. It is part of our life in a broken world and part of our life as believers. We share in the suffering of Jesus so that the weight of his glory can be shared with us too. Do you know what you need at this moment? The Spirit does know. He knows the will of God and is praying now for you in accordance with that will, and God will answer. Nothing can separate us from God. We can have assurance, for even suffering cannot separate us from the hope and the certain glory, resurrection, and restoration he provides. When your roots run deep into his promises and you cling to the deep well of refreshment he provides, nothing can shake you and nothing can make you unfruitful. We hold on in hope.